Hi, I'm Simone W. Johnson-Smith, and welcome to the Immigrant Experience in America. Are you a professional new to the United States and struggling to monetize the expertise you brought across the seas? Are you feeling misunderstood and out of touch because you're struggling to understand the unstated rules of the American culture? Each week, we'll take an in-depth look at the positive contributions immigrants are making to the American culture, marketplace, and life. Our intention is to serve as a bridge from your culture to the American culture, giving you a roadmap of tools and the language to understand the unstated rules of the American culture. Let's get started. Hello, listeners, and thank you for joining us again on another episode of the Immigrant Experience in America, where we amplify and humanize the experiences of immigrants living in the United States and around the world. I'm very happy to bring to you today another interesting guest. His name is Dr. Reginald Frection. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Simone.
How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. I guess I'm going to see if I can answer most of your questions as best as I can.
Yes, I think you're quite qualified. I was happy to search and found you on LinkedIn, and you graciously agreed to talk the issue of trafficking in persons with us. And so I'm looking forward to delving deeper into that with you.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, can you tell us a bit about your heritage, where your family's from? What's your immigrant story?
Well, I don't think it's a straight line immigrant story. I grew up in Trinidad. I'm the only one of my siblings. There's nine of us. I was the only one that was born outside of Trinidad. So I was born in the US, but at a very young age, my mother actually sent me back to Trinidad. So I grew up with, all my brothers and sisters. And it wasn't until I was about, in my early 20s that I leave Trinidad. The path that I took, it's just like really kind of a weird one, I guess. But I've had an opportunity to do a lot of different things, since leaving. It's one of those things, I guess now, later in life, you look back and you have this desire to really kind of nail down your roots, and you see the limitations that it has. I think a lot of people of African descent have the same sort of challenge. The story that I've had is that I know my great grandparents. I don't know how they ended up in Trinidad. But I know my great-grandfather was one of four brothers that somehow ended up in sort of a rural part of Trinidad called Toco. And that's, like the family sort of, origin, at least on my father's side. And so you try to go back and look and see, well, how did they end up in Trinidad? And that's kind of a dead end, So I think a lot of people have that, experience. Best that I know is that somehow they were either recently freed or came from one of the either French Guyana, one of the Caribbean slaveholding countries, and ended up in Trinidad. So yeah, my dad grew up in this rural area. So when he talked about the tough days, you kind of go, wow, So, but the only one outside, all my brothers and sisters are still in Trinidad, and that's kind of the start of it. Like I said, I came back to the United States in my early 20s. So, that's been an interesting journey.
Thanks for sharing. I wonder, what is life like in Trinidad? What was it like for you growing up?
Interesting. When I think back of growing up in Trinidad, I mean, I only have like really kind of fond memories of it, Obviously, all my early schooling was there. In sort of hindsight, I don't know if I was that keen on school back then. I mean, I went, like I said, I'm 8 of 9 kids. All my older brothers and sisters, there's one person after me. And so you kind of went to school, you kind of did what you were supposed to. Carnival is a big part of, the Trinidad culture. So you're always looking forward to that. The holidays are always something, else. It's an experience, you have, I guess it would be the Spanish version of Christmas caroling. They call parang. So you're, look forward to that at Christmas time, And I think one of the big things that I find about Trinidad and I think I'm most appreciative of, I think there's an embracing of different cultures and religions, I mean, growing up, I had friends that were Muslim, Hindu, Christian, and you celebrated all the holidays. You were invited to their houses, and things like that. And I think, once I moved to the US, it's something that sort of really stuck with me because there's not a lot of hang-ups or this conflict that, you often see with people of, different ethnicities or religions and things like that. I mean, I'm not saying Trinidad is without its problems, but I think I'm really, really appreciative of that I grew up in a space where you valued other people and their, their backgrounds. The food is so diverse, I think, because when you look at the culture, I mean, obviously Trinidad has a large East Indian population. So you find that there's a lot of curries. There's a strong Spanish heritage. So you find, there's, dishes that they have. The equivalent would be like almost like a, tamales or something like that. They call, pastel. It has like meats and stuff in it, or there's one that's called pay meats, still made with that sort of, cornmeal base. So one's sort of sweet, one's, on the other side. There's beaches. I don't think there's a bad beach in Trinidad. I know as a kid, I deliberately, I was raised Catholic. So you'd go to church on Saturday evening. So you had your Saturday night free, and then you didn't have to wake up that early Sunday morning. After church, you get together with your friends and go, hey, what are you doing? And it's like, hey, let's go. And you camp on the beach, you spend the night, then, you go home in the morning. So I don't think, there's beaches. I think I can probably get to any beach in Trinidad probably in about an hour, 2 hours, So, yeah, there were always, organized, outings that you take, you go to a beach somewhere. And I think that's how a lot of people spend not only beaches, but there's like some rivers and stuff that you can go to. And you can go hiking. We'd hike over the northern, mountain range to get over to like one of the most popular beaches called Maracas or Las Cuevas. So you'd hike over. It was a normal thing to do. And, spend the day at the beach, So the street food is another. I mean, obviously, there's a strong African influence as well. So you have a lot more like ground provisions, kind of stuff. There's one popular dish called oil down. And there's a lot of ground provisions that you actually sort of steam in coconut milk and some, meat that's really, great.
Bacon shark.
Bacon shark. Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, you gotta go if you go to Maracas. You gotta go to Richards and get some bacon shark. That's a big one. So there's lots of things. Doubles is another, street food. It's like the best I could describe it here would be if you had like sort of a soft taco shell. But this one's a lot more puffier and it's served with like, it's like a chickpea based filling, but it's like to really enjoy it, you've got to have it on the road, right on the side of the road. And, you can get it, dressed however you want with different condiments. It's always, hot sauce in there. So you get to decide whether you want it slight pepper, mild or just, hot. And, so if you're in Trinidad, you got to go for some street food and get bacon shark or the doubles.
Right. I've heard those names before. And I guess the Indian influence and the African influence is very strong on the food is the impression that I'm getting. So, but thanks for sharing that. So then at what point did you get back to the US and started your professional life?
Well, while I was living in Trinidad, I spent the last 3 years I was there. I spent some time at the police service, a special reserve police officer. And I got to a point where I think I developed an appreciation for furthering my education. And so I decided that's what I wanted to do. And one way that I decided that I was going to do that, because I was born in the U.S. and I had U.S. citizenship, I enlisted in the U.S. Army. I was trained as a combat communication specialist. I spent most of my time. I went to school, basic, training, went to my advanced individual training for communications and Army Signal School. I decided I wanted to be a little bit crazy, so I became a paratrooper. I went to, jump school for a little bit. And then I was stationed on Fort Bragg for the next 3+ years. And, once I was trying to decide whether I was going to stay in or get out. And I requested to go temporary duty to Army Criminal Investigation Division. So I did that. They allowed me to go. So I spent my last year in the Army working Army CID as a undercover drug investigator. And that led me to a really, really great man, became a really good family friend, but he was the Criminal Investigation Division commander for the Prince George's County Police Department in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. And he basically recruited me. And I ended up serving, 10 and a half years with Prince George's County Police Department. That led me, again, I finished my bachelor's degree while I was, in the police department. I would go to the nights. I started going back to school when I was in the Army in Fort Bragg. I went to Fayetteville State while I was there taking night classes just to try to work towards my bachelor's. I continued once I got to Maryland, went to Bowie State University, completed my bachelor's, I guess, total in about 7 years. And then 1996, Johns Hopkins University had a program called the Police Executive Leadership Program. I applied, I was accepted, and I ended up with a 2-year master's degree in management and leadership. And I stayed on to the department for another couple years. I think I made, sergeant pretty, quickly. I think in 8 years, I was promoted to sergeant. I ran the community policing, unit for a while. I ran a patrol squad for a while. But most of my time I spent as a robbery detective in the Criminal Investigation Division. And then one day I decided, I wanted to do something different. So I left. I worked for a defense contractor not too far from where I lived, and ended up back at the police department. Interestingly enough, community policing was still a big issue, and they were now putting, computer technology into police cars. And so I ended up working on that project for a while, and that kind of led me to start my own business. And then in 2010, my wife worked for a international financial institution, and I ended up in Hong Kong. And I think that's where my life, really kind of changed, because while I was there, one night, this woman, rang my doorbell. It turns out she was the domestic migrant worker that worked across the hall. And she was in tears because she was hungry. And that led me to start sort of researching the laws in Hong Kong about domestic workers, what were their working hours, what their pay was supposed to be, and all these things. And I started to see these glaring gaps in sort of protection that was afforded to these workers. One of the first things I noticed when I got to Hong Kong, it was on a Sunday. All these workers, it's their day off, and they're allowed to occupy any public space. And so literally, they're sitting in every open space, walkways, parks. It's just thousands and thousands of people, mostly women, on their day off because they're required to live in with their employer. So to really get a rest day, they have to leave the house. If they stay in, they're going to be forced to work at some point. So I thought while I was, researching these laws, I came across this organization. It was part of the community outreach program at the cathedral in central Hong Kong. And I thought, I'll probably volunteer, 1 or 2 days a week. I was familiar with the legal system. It's not, that different from Trinidad, both being, former British colonies. So the legal system is, pretty similar. And so I thought, I'd volunteer a couple of days during the week. And I got hooked. I ended up going every day for almost, 3 years. And, when I left, that's when I decided, I'm going to do my PhD and I'm going to do it in law. Because I thought, if there's some way that I can contribute to making a little bit of difference in the experience that these folks are having, then, I was obligated to do it. So that led me down this whole path about, a lot of human rights training, a lot of human rights. I went all over. Every topic that I could think of related to human rights, I went at least, for years. I ended up going back to Hong Kong and doing my field work for my PhD. And I actually looked at how, governments, what are the obligations of government in protecting, in this instance, migrant workers, but literally any vulnerable group. When I look back, other than the police department, I think, doing a human trafficking work in Hong Kong is the second most rewarding thing that I've done. Every day that I left the office, I knew what I did for that day. And that's kind of compelling that you can, at least one person at a time, you can have at least some small impact about their experience and sometimes their future, I think the biggest thing, take away is that I got to see, because I had the opportunity, I had clients, or previous clients that you help. I had the chance one day to go to Indonesia and visit one of the old clients, and you get there, and it just brings the point home that, Hong Kong is the legal system and the civil system is really tilted towards alternative dispute resolution, negotiation, And a lot of times I think it's a really unfair process. And you get to see that every dollar that is left on the table for a migrant worker is a window that doesn't get put into their home, or, something that they have to go without, because most of them are traveling because they want to improve their condition in their home country. You look at this woman, a year, 2 years later, and she says, I feel cheated. It gives you sort of a different motivation to be a better advocate when they come to you for help, because you know that the money that they have already worked for, that it has a real impact on them back home and their family.
And so how long were you in Hong Kong? How long were you there doing that?
So I got to Hong Kong in January of 2010 and left Hong Kong in September, October of 2012. Well, I left in 12, but I continued to go back through 2013, a little bit in 2014, but I was back in school at the time. And in 2015, I went back. I did my field work there, so I spent almost the entire year. Yeah. And then in 2018, I went back on a contract, so I was there 2018 through 2019. So I spent a good bit of time, in Hong Kong. But I was going back and forth at the time because once I got back from Hong Kong, I ended up in London. So I was going back and forth from London to Hong Kong. Yeah. So
right.
Yeah. But,
okay. And where did you get your PhD? I'm sorry if I missed it.
Oh no. Well, I didn't answer that question. Yeah. So after I left Hong Kong, I was back in the US for a couple of months. My wife then got asked to move to London. I was already committed to do my PhD. And I ended up finding a program. It was the University of York in the UK. And they had a program. It's through their Center for Applied Human Rights. And I told them what I was thinking of doing. I was going to focus on migrant workers in Hong Kong. I was going to try to look at, the government, obligations in providing, a remedy to, human rights violations, violations that I saw as human rights violations. And they said, yeah, so end of 2013, 2014. And basically, one thing I loved about it was they said that, hey, this is a 3-year program. We'll give you 4 probably. And so the pressure was on that you needed to get it done. So I submitted my thesis in 2017, and I did my oral exam in 2018, and the rest is history.
Well, congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but yeah, that was a good. It's kind of interesting because after I got back to Hong Kong, even having at that time worked with migrant workers for since I'd say 2011, the experience was just still informative, I guess, because there are things that you think you know, and then you really, really get into a lot of different interviews, and you kind of realize, wow, there's just some little nuances that you pick up, and it really kind of shapes, the way you think. And interestingly, it's not just, about migrant workers. I think when you sort of apply the underlying principles more broadly, you can see how either government policy or lack of policy really impacts vulnerable populations. So you can apply it to any, group that you consider at risk or disadvantage.
Right.
Eye-opener. Yeah.
It's amazing. One knock at the door led you down to a whole life's work.
Yeah.
And Just a quick question. Is your wife foreign service? Does she work for an organization that brings her overseas? As you mentioned that she
Oh
went to
no, she
London.
worked for a financial institution that is a global financial institution. So yeah,
Okay.
well,
All right.
at the time she did.
So your story brings us to the topic of human trafficking, right? And what you're currently doing in the space. Do you mind sharing a bit of as to how, after getting your PhD, that kind of morphed into now this work that you do today?
It's still sort of a little disjointed, I gotta admit. I didn't get back home until 2019. At that time, I've been out of the country now for 10 plus years. And obviously, you spend a little bit of time. I have two kids, they're, adults in their 30s, but you hadn't seen them, frequently and for a long time. And you try to, sort of kind of get reacclimatized. And then, obviously, COVID hits and everybody's locked in.
Yes, that's right.
I didn't get back till late 2019, so early 2020. You COVID. So everybody's locked in for 2 years. But one of the things I did when I left Hong Kong is I started a nonprofit here in the U.S. called Eris Human Rights International, and my idea behind it at the time was that I wanted to use it to stay in the migrant migration, human trafficking space. Trying to see I could talk to, potential clients, online or over Facebook or, Skype or whatever it was. I could help them, draft an affidavit or statement or something like that. I could provide advice. I could do a live, broadcast with, somebody. And there's a woman that I met while I was there, a migrant worker. I think just the word I would use for it, just really resilient. But she created a Facebook page, and there's, I don't know, right now there's probably 200 plus thousand people on that site. And so it was a good place that you can actually kind of, raise the awareness of rights within that space. I still continue to do that. And, you find that it doesn't even just state of Hong Kong. I had a woman that I had met while I was at University of York. She's a human rights defender in Kenya. And while I was in London, I got this call a note one that says, hey, do you know anybody in Saudi Arabia? And I go, well, no, but I probably can find somebody. So I reached out to, somebody in Hong Kong. Hey, do you know anybody in Saudi Arabia? Yep. And it turns out there was a woman, a Kenyan, that was working in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, who had run away from an employer because she was being abused. She didn't have her papers. And in Saudi or the UAE, you need your papers. It's called the Akima. And without those, you can't really travel. If you get caught without it as a foreign worker, you could be in some trouble. And sometimes the police actually take you back to the employer. So she was in need of medical assistance. She was hiding. And we set up a Facebook chat group. And the woman in Hong Kong knew of another woman, a Filipino countryman near Jeddah. And so it took us a month, but eventually, we got her back to Kenya. And so for me, it was just kind of more that, there's just so much opportunity that you don't have to be, actually on the ground somewhere. But, if you have these links and these connections, these networks, you could make a lot of things happen.
Yes. Okay. So if you don't mind, can you educate us and myself and our audience about this issue of human trafficking? I'm listening to your story and it sounds, you hear about slave stories about being returned to the plantation after they've ran away and all of this thing. And it was just like, it's modern day times and this is still happening, but just a different, what we call modern day slavery. Can you speak to that a bit about the issue itself and where we are currently with trying to combat this international human trafficking?
Where do I start? Okay, so let's start with the terminology first. We refer to it as modern day slavery. And so if we go back and we think about the original type of slavery, where it was chattel slavery or actually owned by another person, they exercise complete domination over your life. They got to decide when you woke up, when you ate, when you went to sleep, who you married, if you did or not. You had no opportunity to say no to any demand that was made. Contrast that today where, pretty much, globally, that sort of, slavery has been abolished. but some of the conditions that keep you trapped in sort of those same slave-like conditions still exist. And it doesn't matter where you go, at least my experiences, when I wanted to find out more about, human trafficking and when I was in Hong Kong, I went to San Francisco for 2 weeks to some training. And, when I left Hong Kong, I was really incensed because it was like, oh my God, what is happening here? You would see, somebody that comes to work as a migrant worker. They're experiencing debt bondage because to travel, they have to find money to do that. You have recruiters in their local villages that recruit them. Don't tell them, exactly who they're going to work for, where they're going to work at times. They have written contracts that I don't want to say nobody. The people that you see, the employers really adhere to. So there's a lot of violations that go on, even rest days. It's not uncommon to find a worker that is going to put in a minimum of 17 hours a day. There's no law that stipulates the number of working hours in a day for a domestic worker. And so you find all these gaps and where it's abused to the detriment of the worker. And so I was really kind of like, oh my God, how could this be happening? So I wanted to find out more. And I went to San Francisco to this organization called Not for Sale. And then I left there incensed because, oh my God, I could swap the name Hong Kong for the United States and it's the same thing happening here. And over the years, it doesn't matter if you're in Kenya, Hong Kong, Australia, the United States, the underlying stories are all the same. Workers are lured by, recruiters or networks of people for jobs that either sometimes don't exist, for jobs that are not what they agree to, or sometimes they're not even told, what the job is going to be. And so you show up in a country at some destination and it's not what you agreed to or what you thought it was. But once you get there, you're indebted. So you can't say no.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's exacerbated sometimes by government policy because in a lot of times, if you're a domestic worker, an agricultural worker, you're tied to a single employer. So once you start having these multiple dependencies, you're actually making the person more vulnerable and more susceptible to abuse and a less likelihood that they can leave if things go bad. Couple that with the main reason why they traveled or they decided to become a migrant worker to begin with, or, a foreign worker, is because they want to take care of their families back in their home country. It's linked to, a lot of times, to poverty. Everybody, wants to improve the condition, their, condition and that of their family. So you have all these things working at the same time. And, a worker gets to a destination country and they're sort of trapped. And sometimes, you say, hey, I don't want to stay here, and they're allowed to leave. But a lot of times, you're going, well, no, you can't, because you get to your destination and you either have your passport seized by an employer. Once you lose your identity documents, who are you? Where do you go to complain? How do you prove who you are? If you decide I want to go to a consulate, if you don't have any papers or a passport, and you get to a consulate, what do you tell them? My name is, X, and, I'm a citizen of X country, but you have no documents to prove it. How do you travel? And so it's this condition that continues to happen. And I think one of the things is that for me at this point, I feel that we're, one, not being successful enough at combating it, preventing it. I think in 2010, 2011, when I started looking at trafficking, human trafficking was the third most profitable organized or transnational organized crime behind arms trafficking and drug trafficking. And at the time, there was something like 21 million people in more forms of modern day slavery globally. Today, human trafficking is second behind arms trafficking. And there's almost 25 million people in forms of modern day slavery globally. So we're not being really successful. My assessment at this point is, the jury might still be out a little bit, but I'm leaning towards thinking that we're addressing the symptom rather than the root cause. What is the real underlying cause of trafficking? We have a large group of people moving either because of climate change, poverty, poor governance. And once you have this large group of people on the move, you have people that are out there taking advantage of their condition. Why are people moving to begin with? And so we can spend a lot of time addressing the symptoms of trafficking. We can, arrest, if it's sex trafficking, we could arrest Johns and, those sorts of things. If it's labor trafficking, we can try to put things in place. But how do we really address this underlying cause that puts people at risk? And I think it's, improvement of economic conditions. What makes people so vulnerable? We talk about it's, you look and see who's usually at risk in a country. Recently, my migrated folks are, always at the top of the list. They're unfamiliar with the language, unfamiliar with the laws. Everybody, I say there's a struggle for assets, human assets that we think of. We can think about your health and, education and those sort of things that make you a little bit more resilient. That allows you then to pursue physical assets, things of material value that also improves your resilience. And then we have social assets like networks that we have, family, friends, churches, political parties, those things, right? And this is, for me, this is what the fight is over. Because if I'm poor, I lack, education and those sorts of things. And it's not necessarily always the case, I've run into people that are, bachelors in accounting and nursing. And, I had one woman, she was a ceramics engineer, but because of underemployment in her country, she was forced to migrate. So there's this struggle, I think, that's going on to, acquire these assets. But most of the time, if you find that somebody, I'm poor, I didn't have a really great, education, I don't have the financial wherewithal, I can't, withstand any shocks to my system, I'm vulnerable to begin with, I end up, somewhere else. The only thing left for a trafficker to do is to remove the last available asset to you, and that is to isolate you from family, friends, any sort of services that can help you navigate a system that you're not familiar with. And so if I can remove that last leg of that three-leg stool, now I pretty much own you, because I was in Orlando at the end of December attending a trafficking trial. And the witness, adult victim, she literally summed it up. She was homeless. She didn't have really any money. She was a drug user, and she was willingly engaging in prostitution. And once this guy picked her up, kept her, I gotta say one thing, the guy was acquitted, but her story was that for about 8 weeks, he kept her on a truck. But when they asked her, well, why, she says, where was I gonna go? What are my options? Because once they take control of you and you have no network that you can rely on to help you get out, you're really trapped. And so I say all that to kind of raise the question: are we really addressing the underlying cause that puts people at risk and make them victims of trafficking? And I think we might need to be just looking a little bit beyond making arrests and those sort of things. One of the things that Congress enacted when they implemented the Trafficking Persons, the TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was to increase the sort of economic, viability for people at risk. I think there's a recognition that we need to do something outside of, enforcement that makes and allows these groups of people that we consider at risk to be a little bit more resilient.
And so part of our initial conversation, we spoke about the trafficking situation here in the US, right? It's a huge international problem. Yeah. And I'm sure Interpol and other folks are involved in trying to figure out what to do, and other law enforcement entities. But can you speak to what is the current situation in the US? What are the states or cities that have the largest, I think we spoke of Georgia being one of those red states, and well, not politically red state, but red
Yeah,
meaning
yeah,
like on the map of huge issue.
yeah. So, I mean, off the top of my head, I don't think I can name it, but I know Georgia is globally is the second in terms of child sex trafficking. Top states, Florida is a really big one as a city. Orlando is a big one. Ohio is a big one. I think the cities on the West Coast, and I think there's really a lack of understanding or awareness about trafficking. So the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, is the domestic implementation of an international convention. So there's the International Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. As part of that convention, there's an additional, they call a protocol, which is like an addendum to that convention. It's commonly called the Palermo Protocol only because it was enacted in Palermo, Italy. But it's the convention to suppress trafficking in persons, particularly women and children. And so because the United States is a party to that, the TVPA is the domestic implementation of that obligation. The thing is that the protocol, it states that at a minimum, it will cover sex trafficking and labor trafficking, or trafficking for forced labor. And literally, I think that's what the TVPA did, just the bare minimum standard, because when we look at the TVPA, it basically covers sex and labor. And I think that's one of the big misunderstandings, because I try to tell every chance I get that we have to think of trafficking as an umbrella. It happens in three sort of dimensions. The act, what do you do? So it's a recruitment, transportation, that sort of stuff. The means, how did you do it? Force, fear, threat of force, abuse of power, abuse of position of vulnerability. And then for what purpose is the last stage. And the purpose is the form of exploitation. So it's always you're trafficked for some form of exploitation. You can traffic for sexual exploitation. You can be trafficked for forced labor. In a lot of countries, you may have kids that are being trafficked for child brides. So you could be trafficked for that. In some countries, you're organ harvesting. So you can be trafficked for. And I think when we think about, the legal framework that we put in place to address the human trafficking issue, we've really been too narrowly focused. There's a case that is commonly, I would say one of the landmark cases that talks about trafficking and the issue of coercion in trafficking situations, and it's United States v. Kaminsky. One of the main arguments in that case was that the Kaminskys were convicted of involuntary servitude, but at the time, the law simply indicated that it could only be for threats or legal process. So if you were threatened that you were going to be for some legal action to get you to perform, that was against the law, or if you were physically restrained, right? And because it was so narrow, the Kaminskys argued that because it wasn't a legal process or they weren't actually physically harmed, that they shouldn't have been found guilty. There were other reasons why they were, but one of the main things that came out from the Supreme Court, looking at that case, was that coercion can involve nonviolent forms. And so Congress was then required to go back and change the law, and they changed it to include serious harm. And, so those are the sort of things that came out of it. And so if we're thinking that we want to have, sort of broad legislation to cover victims of trafficking, we have to sort of predict what communities, individuals, or groups are at risk. What are they at risk for, and ensure that the legislation or the legal frameworks that we're putting in place are broad enough to cover them. And all it may take right now is just to add some language that instead of saying that, it's a transportation, harboring, whatever it is, to include, sex and labor, it could just mean and other forms of exploitation. you know? And so why not, make it broad enough that, you can cover as many forms of trafficking as you can. I did some training a couple of years ago, and it was for the National Sheriff's Association. It was their winter conference. And I remember talking to a sheriff from North Carolina. And I asked him about labor trafficking. And he goes, no, that doesn't happen here. That's the West Coast. We have this misunderstanding about what, trafficking, let's say, for forced laborers. When I was a robbery detective in Prince George's County, the call initially went out as a check on the welfare. Guy owned a Chinese restaurant. He got a call from persons unknown, said they had his mother. They wanted X number of dollars. And so once the officers got there, sure enough, the mother was tied up in the kitchen. I got called as the detective, the robbery detective, because now it's escalated to a home invasion. And I remember going into the basement, and there were 7 bunk beds in the basement. So they were housing at least 14 people there. And so these things are happening right in the smack of your neighborhood, and you're unaware of it. And one of the main things, again, you're isolating these victims. They're working long hours. They can't go anywhere else. They can't work anywhere else, I mean, who's checking to see who's living in the house or, what? And then this happened a few weeks later. It happened to another person who owned another restaurant. And then other, officers or other detectives got involved. And it turned out with the help of the FBI, we were able to determine that these folks were being, brought in from China on the West Coast and then being sort of shipped along the East Coast. So it turned out that, there was this movement of people and working in the restaurant space that we're unaware of. And this is how, law enforcement, you're really going to find a victim that comes to you and says, hey, I've been being trafficked. You're going to hear all sorts of different languages, right? Mm-hmm. And we have to be really kind of, attuned to trafficking for labor doesn't only mean working in an agricultural context. We look at a lot of hotels now are outsourcing their cleaning services. Where are those workers coming from? There's a place that I stay at, every time I'm in New York, or a lot of times when I'm in New York, and you see over the years how the staff has changed, the cleaning staff. At one point you thought, no, these, folks, you talk to them and based on, listening to their language and stuff like that, you can tell that they're probably local. And then at one point it was Eastern Europeans, and you have to ask yourself, how are they coming? And so usually there's a network that's, you got to get a visa to come and work most of the time.
Yes.
If you're here illegally, I mean, who's checking?
Right.
So I think there's just a sort of misunderstanding about how trafficking happens, where it's happening, and, there's got to be an acknowledgement that it's happening right in our communities. It's happening in businesses. And so I think there's an opportunity for every business that comes into existence does so with the authority of the state. Every state has a part of the state apparatus that is responsible for licensing businesses.
Right, the Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, yes.
Right.
And so if we know that there are certain industries, agriculture, the hospitality business, retail services, and we know that these are certain businesses that are prone to trafficking in persons, then I think there's an opportunity for the state to then put some teeth into, legislation that says, if I'm starting X business, then one, I have to be aware that trafficking in persons is a problem with this. I'm going to ensure that trafficking doesn't happen. If there's trafficking that does, and we find that, it was happening and you're responsible, you're going to be penalized. You're going to have to provide compensation to the victims. You're going to have, so you can put some real teeth into that. It's like what happened after Enron, Now every CEO has to certify that their business is being run, properly and, they're doing things right. But you don't do that with a lot of, other businesses. So I think there's an opportunity for more state, regulation of a lot of businesses that are prone to these types of violations. So we need to be doing there's a whole lot of different moving parts. Education is also a big one. I think a lot of times when you think about who's at risk of trafficking, you always think that it's some foreign worker that is here illegally, and it's not necessarily the case. So we need to also start thinking, communication. How do we talk about trafficking, and particularly sex trafficking? And the last thing, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but the last thing is, there's a big push now when we talk a lot about, victim-centered trauma-informed services. It's a big word, a lot of words.
Yes.
But what does that really mean? Obviously we don't want to create, or we don't want to re-traumatize victims. I mean, I had that a lot. I interviewed a lot of people for my research. I interviewed a lot of people just working, in the space. And you always try to, be empathetic and, go slowly and try to, empower people to sort of tell you their stories. I don't think there's a way that you cannot re-traumatize a victim of trafficking. And I say the word victim, I know that a lot of people go, oh no, it's survivors. I use the word victims because when I think about trafficking, I think about the criminal justice system, and the criminal justice system is set up to vindicate the rights of victims.
Right.
That's the only reason why I use victims instead of survivors, right?
Yes.
We really got to look at, how we're doing it. Again, the criminal justice system is set up that it's confrontational. A victim has to come forward and tell you exactly what happened to them in detail to be, effectively prosecuted. And so if we're going to need that sort of detail, sometimes it's a slow process, but how much say does a victim really have? Because it's required international level as well as domestic level. One of the obligations is we prosecute, the perpetrators of this offense. So to really have an effective prosecution, the victim has to be involved. They have to tell their story, and that story will always cause a sort of re-traumatization. So we've got to make sure that we have things in place to make sure that their, mental health needs are being met. Right. And not only that, but to have them to be an effective participant and an effective witness, we've got to make sure that there's a host of other needs are met before we can really, present any evidence. If they're not housed properly, we've got to make sure that they're not, homeless or in the streets. We've got to make sure that they have mental access to, medical care, the counseling, all a host of things. And all these things have to be set up beforehand before we can say whether we're taking, care of a victim. I mean, I learned that firsthand.
Yes.
When I was in Hong Kong, I've talked about it so much that a friend called me one Saturday morning and said, "Hey man, I was at this bar last night and I was solicited by this woman. She looked like she was scared, and I ended up talking to her. And she said that, she was doing this against her will. I told her I knew somebody that might be able to help. So she gave me her number." So he gave me the woman's number. And at the time, I thought, it's Saturday. Every shelter that I know of is closed on Saturday. If I even called and was able to go and get this person, where was I going to take him? So at the time, the Catholic Center in Hong Kong, they had a shelter. I ended up calling, and there's a nun that I had worked with, and I told her what the situation was. And she says, if you can get her here before 5 o'clock, we'll take her. All right. And so I called back and I was like, hey, I can, come, get you, but do you know where you are? She didn't know.
Oh my goodness.
All right. And I was like, wow. Well, I'm going to call you back. See if you can figure out, some address and let me know. And then I didn't hear her, and I called and I called and I called. And that's the last time I spoke to that woman.
Wow. So,
it's one of those things you have to have these things already in place, because if somebody calls and says, hey, I'm in trouble, come get me, you don't have a whole lot of time, and you've got to know where you're going. So there's a host of things that, you've got to make sure that everything is there in place and everybody's sort of driving in the same direction in terms of prevention and protection and, investigations and prosecution. It's all got to be geared towards one thing, and it's the victim. Making sure that we have the proper legislation in place we're never going to stop it totally, but to mitigate its occurrence. If it happens, we got to have the proper tools where we can really support the victim. We can, effectively prosecute with as much minimizing the harm that we cause. And if there's gaps that cause it to happen, we've got to correct them. So there's this cycle, I think, that is always going. We have to predict what's going to happen. Legislation is in place. It didn't work like we thought it was. We've got to prosecute all this at the same time, but we've also got to look at why didn't it work? And then we've got to either tweak the legislation, add new legislation that is informed by the knowledge that we gain. And so there's always has to be this sort of assessment that goes on. But, there's lots of gaps in there because, labor inspectors are always in short supply. People that you go to for help aren't always knowledgeable about what you need. So there's tons of reasons why, the kind of services that would mitigate the occurrence, don't work effectively.
As you're talking, several words keep popping in I'm thinking unaccompanied minors at the southwest border and how they're vulnerable, and we're releasing them to sponsors, right? Sponsors. And of course, the government does its best to vet the folks that are receiving these children, but, they're being encouraged to show up at the border and other people are receiving them. And it's so concerning as to what situations these children are going to be finding themselves in. I saw a billboard in the last few days because January is celebrated as National Trafficking Awareness Month, and the 11th is actually National Trafficking Awareness Day. And there was a billboard that said boys are trafficked as well. Like there's increasing numbers of young boys who are being trafficked. I'm wondering, so it's mostly women, but boys are increasingly being trafficked as well.
I'm trying to think of the term I want to use, but there's a reason why. Even like I said, the Paloma Protocol is to suppress the trafficking of women and children. Globally, that's who's trafficked the most. Women and children. Yep, men are trafficked, boys are trafficked as well. But I think when you look at the numbers, it's overwhelmingly women and children, and particularly girls. And so, you don't want to minimize that. Everybody, I've seen both sides. It depends where you are. If you're in Dubai and you look at all the construction that's going on, it's a lot of men. And from Pakistan, there's a lot of articles that were out there, the last World Cup. They projected that, 4,000 migrant workers were going to die, getting these, event places together. And it turns out, I guess the final number was 6,500, right? And there obviously people are going to say, well, they didn't all die because of, forced labor or, trafficking, things like that. But the thing is, you have to have really good details about how did, so many people die getting a venue going. And when you hear the stories about, most of them were from Nepal. And when you hear the stories about how they're recruited, it's the same. The countries are going to change, the project may change, but the underlying, modus operandi is the same. You're lured by some false promise of better working and living conditions that you can provide for your family with nice wages, And I've been in rooms like that. A woman came one day and she says, hey, I paid $34,000 Hong Kong dollars to this recruitment agency because they said they can get us jobs in Cyprus. But I decided I didn't want to do it. But they don't want to give me back my money. Would you go with me? And I said, sure. So I go to the office and, there's like 20 other women in there and they're all excited because they're promised jobs in Cyprus. And they were mad at this one woman because she decided not to go along. And I'm like, hey, there's no jobs in Cyprus waiting for you. This is how it happens. And could you imagine, even if they got on a flight to Cyprus and once they got there, it's not what they think. Where are they going to go? Who are they going to ask for help? You're really now vulnerable.
Or Cyprus, right? They're telling them Cyprus. Where are they actually really going?
Yeah. And, it's, being just in the space, it's like most of these stories are horror stories. And some of them actually work out, I remember one woman saying to me, hey, could you tell me how to get the visa to Brazil? And I went, what do you know in Brazil? Well, there's this guy that I met online. And I was, oh my God, no, you can't. What are you talking about? She was younger. She was probably younger than my kids. And so my fatherly instinct kicked in and I was trying to really talk her out of it. And she's like, no, I met him through church, And I was like, oh no, once you get there, you don't know what's going to happen. Do you even speak Portuguese? you're going to dependent on this person for everything. You don't know. This is how these stories happen. And sure enough, it's probably now 7 years or something like that. She's married happily. She's got kids, and still we're friends on Facebook, and she's good. But it doesn't work out like that way for everybody. Most of the cases you hear of, this is how it starts. I meet somebody online, or I have a boyfriend that says, hey, go to with these folks, I'm going to come get you. And 3 years later, they're being rescued from some trafficking situation. Stories are all the same,
Right.
and most of the time it's somebody that you know.
I was just watching a little video from Jamaica where a young lady was, luckily she was able to get away. She got into a taxi, first person in the taxi driver picked up several people, dropped off everybody else. She was the last person left, and she's realizing he's not going in the direction that I asked him to go. She started asking him, and he's like, no, we're not going there. He gets on the phone, and he's talking to somebody, and they're negotiating price of how much he's going to sell her for. And this is like happening right now in Jamaica. Taxi drivers.
Yeah.
Okay. It's so alarming to me. And young girls go missing on the island all the time, and they never find them.
Well, that's the thing. And you got to ask yourself, are they actually staying in the country? Within the Caribbean, you can kidnap somebody, get them on a boat, and next thing they end up in some other island, I mean, a lot of times that trafficking is interregional. So somebody goes missing in Jamaica, Trinidad, or wherever it is. One, are they still local? Two, are law enforcement working together to share that information, right? Because you need that cooperation and coordination, and you have to work it together as a regional issue. If you just sort of look at it as, Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, or whatever it is, even in the Caribbean, any country, if you look at it sort of isolated, you're going to miss a whole lot of things. So how do you identify people if you show up, lost somewhere? How do you know where that person's from? I mean, I think they almost need a system like you do for kids when they go missing. There's a big drive many, many years ago where you had your kids fingerprinted and, things like that in case they go missing. Unfortunately, it didn't help you find them a lot faster. In some cases you did, but you've got to know, because there's patterns. A group of people, they're taking you from one place and transporting you to someplace else. There's patterns that you can probably identify, but you've got to be working across borders to really, do that. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Collaboration with law enforcement all across the globe to combat this thing. Wow. I'm quite concerned. And so I'm so happy that we were able to discuss this in depth today. It's interesting, right? Because you were raised in Trinidad, but you were born in the US. Mm-hmm. You still do have a Trini accent. You really do after all these years, right? So I wonder, do you identify as Trini or American Trini or Trinidadian American? And what was that experience like over the years, like navigating, your identity and living in in this country?
It's funny. I don't think I spend a lot of, obviously, it's weird. I got that question asked a lot, where's home? So if you think about it, I spent my first 23 years in Trinidad. I've been gone from there now for over 30, but 10 of those years wasn't even in the US.
Okay, right. That's true. You were traveling overseas and working overseas.
Right. And so when people go, where's home? I find it difficult to answer. I mean, obviously, I'm always familiar with Trinidad. My brothers and sisters are there, like I said. It's not like when you get there, you know exactly where you're going, what to do, right? But I can say that now for a lot of different places. If I go back to London now, I know where I am. I could get onto a subway. I could get onto a bus. I know where I'm going. Same thing if I get to Hong Kong. I get from the airport. I know exactly where I'm going. I can speak a little bit to get me in trouble, but, they can't overcharge me for taking a taxi cab. Right? So, at heart, I feel like, I still really kind of identify as a Trini. I don't think you can sort of escape that. That's your early years, and it kind of, like I said, really kind of shaped who you are. But the biggest thing, I think, it's I think it's because of how I was raised, the experiences that I had there, that I've been able to navigate other places. And I think you look at the history, and particularly of race in the United States, and you have a whole different perspective. You know, when I was in the Army, I went to Fort McClellan, Alabama, to a training for a week. And we were at this bar one night, and we were having a good time. But I looked over, and a lot of the African American guys were sitting over in a corner. And I went over and I said, "Hey, what's wrong with you guys? What happened?" And they said, "Dude, you don't know where you are." And I go, "What do you mean?" He says, "Man, you in Alabama." And
The deep South.
right. And I was like, it didn't mean anything to me, right? Probably, there was a stupid thing, but it didn't mean anything to me. And in hindsight now, obviously being involved in the human trafficking space and really looking at, the impact of, culture and government and institutions, and how it impacts race, you realize that, even though these guys may not have been directly impacted, I guess in some ways you're always directly impacted, but they would have been raised in a way that told them, this is what it was like. This is how you should behave. This is what is expected of you. And I think that's what it meant by, dude, you don't know where you are. So for them, they knew that there was a certain behavior that they were limited to.
Yes.
I, on the other hand, growing up in Trinidad, nobody ever had to tell me, when I looked at the political leaders in that country, nobody had to tell me that, a black guy could be prime minister, or, because that's all you saw, that's all you knew. And again, growing up in Trinidad, I had friends that were Hindu and Muslim and, of all different stripes. And so you grow up with this sort of, really kind of open mindset about other people, cultures, those sorts of things. And I think for me, that's what, has made me able to, I guess, in a way, be successful. Because if you look for it every day, you're going to find it. But you don't let that hamper you from doing the things that you want to do. And everything, it's not, there's not always a racial tinge to everything, Look at me, I'm a, 6'2", 230-pound black guy in Hong Kong. I mean, I left there with lots of friends. And a lot of times, people just don't know. And they're curious. So you just can't take everything as, there's some kind of nefarious racial, motive behind it. When I was there, I spent a lot of times in the Philippines and Indonesia. I traveled to Vietnam. I don't think there's any place that I'd ever gone to where I went, oh, I feel uncomfortable. I think it's just my mindset, right? That you get to sort of dictate the pace about how people respond to you. And obviously, I'm not saying that I haven't had, bad experiences, but I think I've enjoyed the time that I've been able to travel the places I've been to. I did a lot. Like I said, when I started to do my human trafficking work, my human rights work, been to Brussels and Vienna and Italy and all these places that you go, wow. So I think, growing up in Trinidad really kind of gave me a foundation that allowed me to be who I am, as free as I am. And I approach it as, I'm going to be really, nice, cordial, respectful to everybody until they're not.
Right.
Reciprocate.
I completely agree with you. That was indeed I was quite naive about certain things that I was supposed to know about, in quotes, that they were in conversation we had growing up, and it wasn't an issue until I had to learn. And now I feel that it's in my psyche, and it's in my thoughts. And so then it affects your energy and, energy you're putting out to the world and what you're attracting. And so it's very important to be aware of, what you're dwelling on and, and so forth. So I get your point. I completely get that.
But you feel it a lot differently depending where you are.
Yes, I agree with you. I agree. I understand that folks who've been here in this country they were harsh circumstances that they were born and raised in, and over the decades they haven't had a reprieve to experience anything else. So that's their exposure, that's what they know, and so they've learned to um, protect themselves and to operate and behave a certain way because that's the environment they were in. So I also empathize with that too.
Yeah.
So
I mean, interestingly enough, working with migrant workers and doing my field work, it really forced me to look at other things. You see these connections that you didn't even realize that were there, you know? So I was talking to this woman one day and we were talking just simply about her day off, right? And she was like, yeah, I get to decide, when I come back. And as the conversation went on, I said, well, what would you do what would your employer do if you came back late? She thought about it for a really, really long time, and I could see the gears turning, and then like her, face, her expression really changed, and she said these words. At that point, it really clicked for me, and she said to me, "I guess I'm not as free as I thought." It had a lot of implications because the discussion started off with her basically having the autonomy to make these decisions on her own. And it ended with this realization that she realizes that she didn't, but she thought she did.
Yes.
So there's some psychological process that goes on where you feel you have a lot more agency than you did. And so I started to think, well, how was this showing on? I mean, this was about, at the time, about the 30, I had interviewed 30 something other people. And so I went back to my first interview and I started to go over it again. And when I started to read through, this common thread started coming. It reminded me of being a police officer going to domestic violence calls. And this trade-off that people make for peace of mind, to get along, and so I started to kind of take this a little bit further. If you start looking at this sort of imbalance of power in the relationship and this sort of silent struggle for control, once you apply that to the greater society, you start looking at things a whole lot differently, And so for me, just doing that exercise, because if you think about it and you apply it, let's just say to the African American community in the United States, you spend 200 plus years being denied certain, rights. And even though you said, or you were told that there's this equality in treatment, and you're denied it at every step in the legislative process, in the corporate space, in the educational space, you're subjected to all forms of violence, and these folks did it with impunity.
Yes.
People growing up on the other side, even, it was the same thing. It takes me back to my guys in Alabama, right? Not only were you expected to behave in a certain way, you were expected to accept a certain form of treatment. And the people that were growing up on the other side, they could look and tell, well, who in my community has power? Who within the community, is respected and who's not? Mm-hmm. And now we talk about implicit bias, but at one point it was explicit. We don't realize we say implicit now because it has become so ingrained in our society and culture, that we now kind of go, oh, that was just second nature, and it's not really, so how do we deal with it? We want everybody now to have implicit bias training. So then you start asking yourself, how does that community, what kind of coping mechanisms did that community develop to cope with this treatment? And it may extend into all different areas, which came first, did the policy come first or did behavior come first, right? Was the behavior in response to some harsh policy? So once you really start looking at it, this sort of broad concept about how people react to certain oppressors, it's interesting.
Yes, and this is a conversation we could carry on and for a bit longer, but I want to be respectful of your time. Yeah. So I wonder if if there's any advice in particular that you may have for whether it's migrants who are here who might be listening, immigrants, expats coming into the United States, or even moving to some other country around the world. about how to survive, how to thrive, how to keep themselves out of the trafficking ring.
That's a toughie. I feel like I was sort of fortunate. The people that I've run into that helped me. But one thing I would say, you can't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be passive. Don't be shy. Don't suffer in silence, I guess. If you need assistance, find somebody, church, somebody within the community that you feel that you can go to and ask. Because I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people end up, in a worse situation, is because they're either feel ashamed, fearful. The alternative is worse. You have to, one, ask somebody for help, and hopefully, they can get you into the right place. The other thing that I would say is, you gotta have a plan. And it doesn't have to be detailed where you're gonna stick to everything, but generally you gotta have broad strokes about, before you even move, what are you gonna do? Just picking up and going somewhere where you don't know anything. When I decided to move to the US, I had friends that were already here. I reached out to them. You had a place that you could go, you could sleep, you can, kind of get your way around. I knew what I was going to do, or what I wanted to do. It probably wasn't what I wanted to do, for the rest of my life, but it was that small step that I go, okay, fine, I'm going to go from this place to this place. And then you sort of build from there. Education was one of the things I wanted to pursue, and I was able to do that. That was kind of one of the main things on my plan, was to continue, the educational path. So you gotta reach out and have at least a network of people. You're gonna be unfamiliar with the laws and the ways and the customs and things like that. But the one thing you can rely on, at least, is to reach out to somebody within the community that you're gonna go, that can sort of help you navigate the system. It's always gonna be tougher if you just kind of blindly, jump, and you don't have your basic needs. You're gonna need a place to sleep, eat, and to figure out what your plan is. But you gotta have somebody, some network, that those assets I were talking about. You gotta start with the network of people that you know.
Right. Yeah, because otherwise, and don't move from overseas and go to a country not knowing where you're going exactly, how legitimate whatever situation you're getting. I heard of a young lady who asked her uncle to buy a ticket for her. The uncle she said, "Oh, I have a job lined up," bought the ticket. She's getting on a bus to go to somewhere in South or North Carolina. She doesn't have a phone number. She doesn't have a name. She just was told to meet at some place at the train station. She don't, what work was this? And so be careful when you're getting into these very sketchy situations, that you could potentially be a trafficking victim or worse, And so, take the doctor's advice and research and make sure you have a very solid network on the other side before you leave your home.
Yeah. I mean, like, again, every story that you hear, kind of starts off like that. You don't know who is waiting for you on the other end. And lots of times, sometimes it's willingly. Sometimes, a family member may say, "Hey, you can go do X, for the time being until,
Right.
And you go, and next thing you end up in, a situation where you can't get yourself out of, So you're always, even though it's family, if you even smell that there's some illegality in it, don't do it. Always keep it on the up and up, because one of the things that makes you even more vulnerable is if you're afraid to come forward because you think you did something wrong.
Right.
So, do it legally. If you do it legally, you're in the country legally, and something happens, going to the authorities is always the option, And unfortunately, if people, if you decide that you're going to come in without the appropriate papers or things like that, you're putting yourself even at risk, because it's one of the pressure points that a trafficker will use to keep you in a bad situation. If you leave, I'm going to turn you into the authorities.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Keep it legal.
Wonderful. Yes. Nice bookend on everything. I thank you so much, Doctor, for your time. It's been quite informational. I've learned a lot listening to your stories, and quite sobering just how serious the issue is and how the numbers are increasing. And oh my goodness, it seems to heading to be like perhaps the number one issue if we don't really move with legislation and other actions to kind of curb this.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I'm always happy to share, my experiences on the topic, because I think it's really important thing to really, try to put an end to. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your work. All the very best to you. Much success. Thank you for your time on the show today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Tune in next week for another episode of The Immigrant Experience in America. As this is a new podcast, we welcome any and all support. If you have not done so already, subscribe on the Apple Podcast app, Google Podcast app, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. You can also support us by completing a 5-star rating and review and sharing our podcast with your friends, family, and circle of influence.